Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Over the past couple weeks, I've been traveling throughout Europe with my wife, so we went to both Germany and Amsterdam. And so in this video, I want to talk about that trip and all the places that we went and things we saw, but then also, of course, some of the more important things, like the foods that we ate, as well as the games that we played while on travel. And this trip was kind of unique because we literally went in order to play video games. We went to an event called Ludo, which was like a retro gaming weekend. We had a lot of fun. Either way, these are some of my favorite videos to put together, and so grab a snack and drink and let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, let's start with a quick background. So I have been to Germany before. I actually spent about 2 months there at one point, about 15 years ago. It was for a military school and it was down in Bavaria, so the southern end of the country. But during that trip, I also spent a week in Berlin, which is where we were visiting on this trip, and so I was somewhat familiar with the city already. Now, in addition to Berlin, we also spent some time in Amsterdam, and that was my first visit there. I think I've mentioned it before, but my wife used to be a flight attendant, and she used to fly all the time between New York and Amsterdam, so she's really familiar with the city, so she was kind of showing me the ropes while there. But she had never been to Germany, so it was kind of a nice dual trip for each of us in that we both saw some new things. Now, traveling from Hawaii to Europe can be a pain in the butt. You basically have to set aside 2 full days of travel just to be able to get there in between all of the connections and everything else. So to give you an idea, we flew from Hawaii to the West Coast, that's about 6 hours, and then from the West Coast over to Europe, which is another 11-hour flight. And even then, once we got into Europe, we still had some other connections to actually get to Berlin. So we knew going into it that it was going to be a pretty long travel process, and so I wanted to make sure we were completely prepared when it came to entertainment options on the flight. To start, I have this backpack which I used as my carry-on, and this basically had everything inside of it. And I picked up this new backpack a couple months ago. My older one, which I really loved, was just getting really worn down. Now, I had gotten a lot of good advice about a bunch of other backpacks that seemed to be really great, but a lot of them were very expensive and seemed to be a little bit overkill for my needs. So really, I just ended up buying the more modern version of the same backpack that I already owned, and I've been super happy with it. Now, inside the backpack is where all the magic happens, so this is my electronics organizer. In the top compartment, I just have a bunch of various USB cables that I can use to both charge and connect to whatever I have. Also inside, I have a USB-C hub in case I need to connect anything to my laptop, and then I also brought a wireless 8-bit controller. And this is an Ioneo branded one that was made in partnership with them, and honestly, I didn't really use this one at all. The idea is that maybe I would prop up my Nintendo Switch or my ROG Ally and then use this instead of the inbuilt controls, but I mostly just played everything in handheld mode instead. Either way, yeah, it's a nice little controller. Now, in the bottom compartment, I have a couple other things. So first, I have my wireless headphones, so I use this when watching movies and even playing games. I also brought a small Logitech mouse so that I could get work done easily on my laptop. And in order to charge everything, I brought my Ugreen 140-watt wall plug. Now, funny enough, I completely forgot to bring my European plug adapter, but thankfully my wife brought a travel adapter, so we were good to go. Now on the right side, I have my X-Real Air 2 glasses, and so these are AR glasses. I did a whole video about them. And I never really bring these on travel, but I had the idea of maybe using these on the long flight instead of staring down at a screen. But to be honest, I was just so self-conscious about bringing these glasses out and putting them on a flight that I ended up not doing it at all. I think it was just a little bit too far into the whole nerd thing for me, and I like to travel a little bit inconspicuously as well, and so this was just a little bit too much, and it ended up being a waste that I brought them in the first place. Who knows, maybe I'll try traveling with them again and finally get up the nerve to actually put them on, but it is a little bit awkward to do in public. And finally, the other main accessory that really helped with the entire travel process is my big old battery bank. This is also from Ugreen. It's 25,000 milliamp hours, but the big thing that separates this one is that it has a 140-watt PD charge. Now, this is way more wattage than any of my devices actually need, but I love the fact that I can fast charge as fast as it'll go with any of my devices, including my laptop or my ROG Ally X. I also love that it actually shows your percentage remaining on the battery, so I know exactly how much charge I have left. So this thing really came in clutch, especially on those long flights, so I could play the ROG Ally X, and then once the battery got down to about 20%, I would plug this in and then let it get back up to around 75, and then play it all over again. And so I was able to play almost the entire time that I wanted to on those longer flights. But also bear in mind that I was doing things like reading and watching movies, so I wasn't just like gaming the entire time. Now, in terms of gaming, let's talk about what I brought. So number one, I brought my Anbernic RG35XXSP. I think this is one of the easiest devices to take around on travel just because it's clamshell, so it's easily protected. But to be honest, I didn't play a lot on this device at all. I think part of it was the fact that I was going specifically to a retro gaming event, and so I didn't want to get burnt out before I even got there. So in the end, I ended up mostly playing PC games on my ROG Ally X. I really wanted to get through some of my Steam back catalog, and I thought this was a good dedicated time to really crunch. Now my ROG Ally X is still running dual boot, both Windows and Bazzite, and I stayed on Bazzite the entire time. So essentially I was just treating this like a Steam Deck, but with an 80 watt-hour battery, which came in clutch when it came to those longer flights. And because I had so much battery to work with between the Ally X as well as my battery bank, that I didn't feel bad using it for actual AAA games that were going to eat the battery quickly. So the majority of my time was spent playing Control as well as Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I actually beat both of these games. Bear in mind that I already had save games for each of them, and so I probably put about 6 hours of gameplay into each of those games in order to beat them. I also got started on another PC game that I've been meaning to replay, and that is BioShock Remastered. And then finally, I also had some early access codes to try out some pre-release games, and so I also tested those as well. The first game is called Iron Meat, and this is made by a company called Retroware, and so they are made by Screenwave Media, the same people that put on Too Many Games, the fest I went to earlier this year. Now this game I would describe as being a cross between Contra and Doom. So the gameplay mechanics themselves feel a lot like Contra. It's a run and gun, and it does have varying levels to it as well. But also the overall spirit of the game kind of feels like Doom. You know, your character looks like Doom Guy, and there's also a ton of blood and gore. Either way, I think this one comes out in the next week or two, and it's about $20, and I think it's well worth it. There's about 8 levels altogether with a ton of replayability. The next test game I tried out is called Parking Garage Rally Circuit, and this one is modeled after old school Sega racing games, and so this was a lot of fun as well. So the idea here is you're just running through these parking lots, but it does feel a bit like a rally course as well. And the drift mechanic in this game is awesome, so it is kind of a mix between something like Sega Rally Championship and then like Mario Kart as well. Either way, I've been really enjoying this one, and I think this also comes out here really soon, and I think it's going to be pretty cheap as well, I think under 20 bucks. So those were the games that I mostly played while on travel, you know, a few AAA games that I really put some hours into, and then also testing out some other ones that I really enjoyed. And then finally, I also brought my Nintendo Switch OLED, and this was because we were going to use it at that gaming event because we needed extra Joy-Cons. And I think this is probably my first time I've ever traveled with my own Nintendo Switch, and it ended up being a very travel-friendly console. Not only does the battery last pretty long, but the case that I have for it, which is by a company called Spigen, just gives me a little bit extra added grip, and so it felt pretty good in handheld mode. I mostly spent my time playing Super Mario 3D All-Stars, specifically Super Mario Galaxy, and I got maybe 2 hours into this game as well. And I forgot how much I love Super Mario Galaxy. I still think it is probably the best 3D Mario game that has been made. Now the final thing I wanted to talk about when it came to gear is my sling bag, because I ended up using this almost every single day. This is a new bag from Mechanism. In fact, they sent this over when they sent over that pillow that I had reviewed a few weeks back. And even though I have a ton of different sling bags, I thought this would be a great opportunity to test this one out in a real world scenario. Now to start, this is not a cheap bag, it's $80, but it really does feel high quality. The bag itself is made out of canvas, and the straps are super sturdy. One of my favorite things about the straps is it actually has a Mechanism attachment. So if you wanted to quickly attach something like your phone or maybe even a battery brick, you could totally do that. It also has water-resistant zippers to it, and they feel really good too. Now inside it is very roomy. In fact, there is room for an ROG Ally X or even a Steam Deck. And it also has a mesh compartment if you wanted to throw other accessories in here as well. One of my favorite aspects is that it has a pass-through charging thing at the front, so it'll go into the other compartment. And this is the feature that I ended up using the most, because for the most part I didn't actually travel with my ROG Ally X when I was going out and about in town. Instead, I used it for my battery bank as well as a snack and drink in case I needed it. And this was great to be able to top up my phone as well as my wife's phone throughout the day. The front flap also has a bunch of storage, including a mesh compartment and then a bunch of wire holders as well. And you've also got a smaller pouch here if you wanted to put any valuables, and then also another Mechanism adapter. So overall, I use this sling bag all the time and I really enjoyed it. It's a little bit thicker than I was expecting, especially when you have it full, but I think it's still a lot easier to use than a full-on backpack. And so as you watch me walking around throughout different museums and whatnot, I have this sling bag on me almost the entire time, and it was great. So now that we have the setup of, all of the accessories and all the gaming that I did, let's actually talk about the trip itself. So to start, we traveled to San Francisco, then to Frankfurt, and then finally to Berlin. And for the majority of those flights, I was using my ROG Ally X, and it was a great fit, especially when you rest it on the tray table. It just takes a lot of that weight off your hands. So I was able to play this for hours on end, both because of the battery as well as the comfort and ergonomics. Either way, we are super excited to finally make it to Berlin, although we did find that the temperature was quite a bit hotter than it is in Hawaii right now. Thankfully, it's not quite as humid, and so it's a little bit more tolerable, but all the same, yeah, we weren't expecting to go to Berlin and get hotter, especially because the last time I was in this city, it was during the winter time and it was freezing cold. So we ended up staying in a more centralized area that made most things walkable, and we were near Alexanderplatz. This is one of the main travel hubs within Berlin, and so most of the time you can catch, a train or a bus or whatever from this station. So on our first day there, we decided to hit up some museums, and the first thing we did is we went to the Computerspiele Museum. So this was located on the eastern side of the city, and it's a museum dedicated to computer games. Altogether, it's a relatively small museum, but they have a ton of different demos and examples out there. It's a very interactive museum, and so I really enjoyed that. And it is cool to be able to see some of these older retro consoles in real life, like the Atari Jaguar or the Panasonic 3DO. And I forgot just how big and chunky the Atari Lynx is, and so it was cool to see it in real life. They do have a bunch of different games that you can demo there. They've got a whole wall of them, and so you can choose them and then play each of these as well. And like I mentioned, there's just a ton of different interactive segments as well, so it's a very hands-on sort of museum. And two of these standout exhibitions they have are some of the oldest arcade cabinets in the world. They both had Computer Space from 1971, as well as Pong from 1972. And these are obviously way before my time, but it was still awesome to be able to see something so old just right there in front of you. And they also had the internals of the Pong cabinet available to see, and this was pretty awesome as well. They also had a couple rooms that were dedicated to capturing the look and feel of playing games back in the day. There's like a full 80s style arcade in there, and then also they've got a couple different living room setups as well. And these are each tied to different eras, so they have the Atari 2600 era in a living room from the 70s. And then they also had a Commodore 64 area that was organized to look like it was in the middle of an attic. And so I thought this was pretty cool. They also had an area for NES and PlayStation, but they had people there, and so I didn't get any footage. Now, one thing that was really interesting with this machine that they called the Pain Station, and this was only about 20 years old, and this was made more like an art exhibition than an actual game. But the idea here is that you would play Pong, and then if you did poorly on it against the other opponent, then you would be punished physically. So I had to agree to a bunch of health warnings, but then after that I was able to play this game, and I played it with Chuck, who's the organizer of that Ludo event that we were going to afterwards. And Chuck used to work at this museum, so he knew what he was getting into, and also he is very good at Pong, and so I had all the chips stacked up against me. And so every time that you failed in this game, you had one of three things happen to you. The first was a bunch of heat on your hand, which honestly wasn't too bad, but then also there was an electrical shock, which didn't feel great, and then they also had a whip attachment that would smack you in the hand a bunch of times every time that you got it. And the goal of this game is to keep your hand on that space while it's punishing you while still trying to play. And as expected, I totally lost in this, and so I got the gamut of all those punishments. And I was surprised at how much I did not like that whip. Man, that thing hit me pretty hard. In fact, it left a welt on my hand for a couple days afterwards. Either way, it was a super unique experience, but I was ready to move on to a different museum after that. So from there, my wife and I went over to a museum called Gemaldegalerie. Now, Berlin is known for all of its art and museums, and they actually have an entire area called Museum Island with a bunch of national galleries, and it's really impressive. But personally, I had already done that in my last trip to Berlin, and so my wife ended up going and doing that herself during the retro gaming weekend, and so we went to Gemaldegalerie instead. Now, this museum mostly focuses on portrait paintings, as well as the medieval and then up through the Renaissance era. And they have everything segmented by region, so they have a bunch of Italian paintings, and then they also have Dutch and German paintings as well. And I really love these eras when it comes to art. I think that the free expression of art was just really starting to build up, and so some of these paintings are really remarkable. Personally, I really like the still life stuff and then a lot of portraits as well, and so I think this was really right up my alley. And there were a couple paintings that I had recognized from previous art books and stuff, so it was really cool to be able to see some of these in real life. One of my favorite surprises is that the cover art for one of the Fleet Foxes albums is taken from a Dutch painting, and that painting was in this museum as well, so it was pretty cool to just walk into the room and see that. Anyway, this was our first day in Berlin, so after going through those two museums, we were pretty tired, so we just did a little bit of walking around and then picked up some dinner, and then we were ready for our next day. And so on this day, we were going to move to a different city called Holland to go to that retro gaming event. But that didn't start till late afternoon, and so we filled up our morning with a walking tour throughout Berlin. Now, personally, I usually like to just kind of go out and discover things on my own, and so I'm not a huge fan of tours, but I will say that going through Berlin with a walking tour is really helpful. Berlin is a city just filled with history, and so it is great to have somebody walking alongside you and telling you about all the things that you probably would miss if you were just walking around on your own. So to start, we went over to that museum island and just had a look at some of these buildings, and they are pretty incredible. A lot of these buildings had to be restored after World War II just because of all the bombing, and then even then, some of that didn't happen until after the unification of West and East Germany. But I will say that even 15 years after my first visit here, a lot of this stuff had been built up. So if you are looking to try out a bunch of different museums, Museum Island is pretty great. And some of the restoration actually used original building parts, and so you can see bullet holes in some of these buildings from when the Soviets first took over Berlin. From there, we walked along some of the more iconic areas of Berlin and talked about, there's the history leading up to World War II and then everything after that. We also took a stop over at Checkpoint Charlie, which used to be the gateway between East and West Berlin. Nowadays, it's just a little photo op opportunity, but it is pretty cool to be able to see that this is still here. There's also some sections of the Berlin Wall still standing, so we went and visited that as well. And again, this is one of those things where having a walking tour was super handy because our guide was able to tell us most of this history as we were walking around. They do have a bunch of plaques that you could read and learn a little bit more about the history as well, so if you wanted to spend an entire day just checking out the Berlin Wall, there's definitely enough content there for you. Now, one place that was really interesting was just this regular old parking lot inside of an apartment complex. But underneath this parking lot is the bunker where Hitler died. And I thought this was really interesting because the parking lot just looks like any other parking lot other than one little sign that says that this is where the bunker was. And this was essentially made by design because they didn't want to bring attention to any sort of monument or place for Hitler just because, neo-Nazis and all that other kind of stuff. And so it was pretty harrowing to just kind of stand in this place that you knew was rich in history, but really just looked like any other place in the world. In addition, we went over to the Holocaust Memorial, and so this was a really touching area as well. And all things considered, this is a relatively new memorial. It came out in 2005, and it has a bunch of these concrete slabs all across it. And these blocks are really up for interpretation, but sometimes when you're walking through them, it feels like you're walking among tombstones, and it also is very disorienting, which I think is a good kind of metaphor for the entire Holocaust period. So I would say that if you are going to be visiting Berlin, this is a must-visit location, just to kind of get a sense for everything that had happened during World War II. And I was surprised to see just how personally affecting this was in the middle of Berlin. I've been to concentration camps throughout Germany in my previous trip, but this also had a very similar eerie feel to it. And as someone who studied history throughout my life, I really appreciated having this monument in the center of the city so that anybody could go through and kind of remember everything that had happened during this time. And finally, to cap out our tour of Berlin, we ended at Brandenburg Gate, which is probably one of the most iconic locations of the entire city. This gate was built in the 1700s and had been rebuilt and restored over the years. But one of the more interesting things I learned about this square that I didn't know before was that the hotel that's in this square, Hotel Adlon, this is the place where Michael Jackson dangled his kid over the balcony way back in the day. So if you remember that, this is the actual hotel. So I thought that was pretty cool. Anyway, that's about it when it came to Berlin. It was super hot and kind of dry while we were there, but I think it started raining immediately after we left. Before we move on, I do want to talk a little bit about the foods that we ate. This is always like the most important thing for me. First thing I loved is that because it was summertime, there were a lot of fresh fruits and berries available. And all your standard berries, raspberries, blackberries, and strawberries, these were all amazing. But then also they had red currants. And this is a berry that you really can't find in the United States at all, and especially not in Hawaii. So I bought multiple packs of these. Now these are super tart berries, but they are some of my favorites, so it was awesome to be able to dig into these. Now, in addition, they had damson plums, and I hadn't seen any of these in a long time. I grew up in a fruit orchard in Washington State, and we had a couple of these trees, and we used to eat them all the time, but honestly, I haven't really had them since then. And so I ended up eating a ton of these plums as well. They were also super tart, but that's the way I like them. Some of the other things we found in Berlin probably come as no surprise. For example, that there are just a ton of Haribo gummies. In fact, they've got basically any shape or size that you can think of. And so we picked up a bunch of bags of these because I do love gummy bears and that kind of stuff. They also had some Mario branded Haribos, and I thought this was pretty cool. I'd never seen a crossover like this, so I did pick up a couple bags, but I haven't tasted them yet. I was also surprised to find that the major flavor that they use for their potato chips is paprika, so it's got a little bit of a peppery taste to it. It's not bad, but definitely not something that you see in the United States. In terms of actual meals, we had a couple times where we tried out currywurst. This is a type of sausage that's covered in a curry-style ketchup. And this can be served with either bread or fries, and yeah, it's really tasty. Of course, another thing that Germany is known for are their doner kebabs, and so we had a couple of these as well. For the most part, I am gluten-free, and so I regularly do not eat bread, but when it comes to a doner kebab, I am willing to make an exception. And yes, as expected, these were super tasty. Okay, from there we took about a 40-minute train ride down to a town called Halbe. And this place is tiny. I think there's around 1,500 people that live here altogether. Now the reason why we were going down here was actually the reason for the entire trip in the first place. We were going to a gaming event called Ludo. And so let me explain the background for this whole Ludo thing in the first place. To start, here are the founders of Ludo. This is Chuck and Tanya. And Chuck I've known for years. He is the YouTuber behind the channel RG Geek. And this channel came out around the same time as mine, and it focused on the Anbernic RG350M, at least in the beginning. And that's very similar to my channel, which started with focusing on the RG350 devices. And so I've known Chuck for all these years, and he puts on this little gaming event every year called Ludo. And they do it at a place called the Esperanto Stasio. And you may or may not have heard of Esperanto. This is a constructed language, and there's a bunch of different centers around the world that focus on this language. And it just so happens that both Chuck and Tanya are Esperanto speakers, and so that was kind of the impetus to getting this whole thing started. Now the Esperanto Stasio, the building that we were in, is actually an older train station. It no longer is a train station. They've moved that across the tracks, but it still has all of the makings of that older building. But the building itself functions as an event center. So every year they have this thing called Ludo, where they have a gaming weekend. And every year Chuck sends me an invite to this thing. And I'm always like, I can't travel across the world just to play video games for a weekend. But I don't know, after saying no for about 3 years, I was finally like, you know what? Why not? And my wife and I have been itching to go to Europe together. It's been a long time. The last time we were there, we were still dating. I actually proposed on that trip. And so yes, we basically flew across the world to be able to play video games, but of course it wasn't really about the games, it was about the people and just the overall experience. And so we had the building to ourselves the entire time. We had all our meals here, and then we also had a bunch of different gaming stations. Before we talk about the games, let me talk about some of the people that were there. You might be familiar with some of them. To start, obviously there was Chuck, one of the co-organizers of the entire thing, and he has a channel called RG Geek. I also got to meet Ironclad Cobra, who's based in Germany. So he is a YouTuber as well, but I've known him for a lot longer than that. We used to DM back and forth on Discord, and then he started up a YouTube channel, and he's been doing that for about a year or two at this point. So it was great to be able to meet him. He brought a bunch of lovely gifts for me and my wife as well. Another German YouTuber I met while there is this guy, De Bear Bastelt. And he has a German language YouTube channel that focuses on a bunch of different electronics things. I will leave it linked down below. And then finally, I had the opportunity to finally meet Mashtech, and so he's one of my oldest YouTube friends. We started our channels around the same time and again focused on the RG350 devices. And we had worked together many times over the years. In fact, we had done a couple collaborations back in the day and stuff, and so it was awesome to be able to finally meet him in real life. A lot of the guides that he has on his channel were the inspiration for me starting my own channel in the first place, so I think it was really awesome to be able to finally meet up with him. Now let's talk about some of the gaming setups that they had for Ludo. To start, we had this 4K projector, which was connected to a 100-inch screen. And we could basically hook anything up to it. So we had an Xbox as well as a dock to be able to use it with a Switch or even an ROG Ally. And there was also a point where we had a GameCube hooked up to it so we could play F-Zero GX. And for the most part, this is what we used to be able to play a lot of our multiplayer sessions, including things like, a Dr. Mario tournament. And then we also did some 6-player Ninja Turtle Shredder's Revenge, which was pretty awesome. There were a couple other games in there as well, but I didn't get a lot of footage for it, but we did have like 8-player virtual racing. That was pretty cool too. And there were a couple other times where people were playing elsewhere, so I was able to sneak in a little bit of gaming on this big old projector, which was pretty awesome. So for example, I was able to play BioShock via my ROG Ally X on a 100-inch screen, and it looked cool. Another station had a Nintendo Switch as well as a GameCube, and this was set up for 4-player gaming sessions. The GameCube in particular was pretty awesome. We had a mixture of both Japanese and European controllers, and Tanya, the other co-founder of Ludo Event, had her own modded GameCube. It had an SD card reader, and it also had HDMI connector, so you could plug it into basically any display. Now upstairs, we had a couple other cozier gaming setups as well. On the left side, we had an old Atari plug and play. Now this is not the original Atari. I think this thing came out around 2005. So it's only about 20 years old, but it's a compilation of old Pong style games that you can play. And part of me thinks this is why Chuck is so good at Pong and why he beat me in that Pain Station game, because he has this thing to practice with. Now to the right of that, we had a Lego NES, and this was brought over from Mashtech. Now you may have seen this Lego set previously, but this has actually been modded to be playable. So essentially he has put a Raspberry Pi 4B inside of it and then also added an LCD panel to the front. From there, it's set up with RetroPie, and they've got a couple USB NES controllers, and away you go. Now he did show me the inside of it, and it's even got speakers inside as well as a controller board, so everything works really well. And I think this is a pretty cool idea, to be able to take a Lego set and then modify it to actually make it useful. And I feel like if I wasn't making like 3 videos a week, these are the kind of projects I would do. So I just loved seeing something like this. Further along in this room, we had what they called the grab and play station. So a bunch of people had brought handhelds, and so they were available for anybody to try out. In addition, Chuck brought his old Game & Watch, which is the original Super Mario Bros. I had never tried this one before. It's kind of hard to play, but pretty cool to see. And then finally in this room, we had a big Sony Trinitron hooked up with both the Super Nintendo and a Nintendo 64. And of course, there was also some DVD copies of Season 1 of Knight Rider. This is a very German thing to have that here. In addition, there were some dance mats set up if people wanted to play DDR, and they also had some VR stuff, but I didn't get any footage of that. Now, the big highlight of the trip was a Mario Kart tournament that we had on Saturday. And because everybody was playing, we made it single elimination, so that way we weren't playing for like 8 hours straight. But we had brackets and everything. It was kind of a real deal tournament. To start, we played Mario Kart Double Dash on the GameCube, and I ended up winning my heat, and so I was in the semifinals at that point. From there, we moved on to Nintendo 64, and I totally lost here, and so I was eliminated. And then after that, the finals were on this Super Nintendo, and so I thought that was pretty cool to be able to play on multiple systems, but, you know, essentially playing the same game. So among the 15 players, I ended up getting 4th place, and I was pretty happy with those standings. And as prizes for everybody, I brought a bunch of handhelds. You know, I had a bunch of these that I was getting ready for a charity auction, but I thought, you know, I'd rather actually just hand these to people and see how much they enjoy them right then and there. So I ended up shipping all this stuff over to Germany, and then we handed them out as prizes. It was pretty awesome. Many of these devices had shown up in my videos previously, and some of these, like the RGB30, was my original device that I had put a lot of hours into. Anyway, that was really about it for Ludo. We just kind of hung out, you know, ate a bunch of snacks and enjoyed just playing video games. It was a really relaxing weekend. And we also weren't sequestered, you know, playing video games the entire time. We went and took a bunch of walks as well. And so it was just a really nice, relaxing weekend. But after that, our time in Germany was through, so it was time to pack up our stuff. We went over to the airport and then flew over to Amsterdam. Now, like I mentioned, I had never been to Amsterdam before, but, you know, I've seen it in the movies, and I've always been really interested in this city. And to start, it's just a beautiful place. There's just cobblestones everywhere, and transportation is just kind of in your face the entire time, and I really enjoyed that. This city in particular is known for all of the bicycles that it has, and yeah, that's no exaggeration. There are so many people riding bikes. On top of that, they've got buses and trams and underground rail stations as well, and so there's just a ton of different transportation options, and it's all right there. But to be honest, the city itself is relatively small. You can walk across most of the city in just an hour or two. And so we did spend most of our time just kind of walking around, you know, checking out the canals and everything else. You know, a lot of these buildings are really cool looking. Part of me wanted to rent a bicycle and kind of take that around as well, but man, it was so chaotic. Like knowing where to go and when was just a lot, even while walking, and so I decided not to go that route. Either way, I found Amsterdam to be a very quaint city, and you know, the weather was perfect at the time for me as well, and so I just really enjoyed my time here. And like I had mentioned previously, my wife was very familiar with the city, so it was great to have like my spouse be a tour guide and kind of take me to all the places that she had visited back in the day. So let's talk a little bit about all the things that I saw and experienced in Amsterdam as a first-time visitor. To start, the Netherlands in general are just known for all of its tulips and windmills, and I didn't really see any windmills. We were obviously in a big city, but I also didn't see any tulips either because it wasn't the right time of year. In fact, they were selling a lot of the bulbs, but you know, these are all going to bloom in the spring. Another thing that the Netherlands are known for are stroop waffles, and so these are really thin kind of wafer waffles that have some syrup or caramel inside. And you can find these sold basically everywhere in like department stores and grocery stores, but then they also have like stroop waffle shops. And so here you can buy these like fresh and warm, and so if you want to get something that's a little bit more ornate, they have those as well. Holland as a country is also known for its Gouda cheese, and there were a ton of cheese shops in Amsterdam. A lot of these were very touristy, but I swear, you could walk around any corner in the city and it felt like you would find a cheese shop. Another place we visited is Tony's Chocolonely store. This is a chocolate brand that you may have seen previously, like for example, they're stocked at Trader Joe's. And this is a Dutch chocolate manufacturer, and so they make some really good stuff, really nice thick bars. And here at this shop, you could actually build your own bars with its own labeling and ingredients as well. And so this was a neat little place to shop. They had some specialty flavors that I had never seen before. However, bear in mind that if you're just going to be buying these standard bars, then you're much better off just going to a grocery store as opposed to this shop. You'll be able to find most of the same chocolate bars for about half the price, so it's going to be about €3 instead of 6. Another thing I knew about Amsterdam is that they had frites shops, or places that sold French fries. I was also surprised to find just how many of these there were as well. And they've got a bunch of different options. You can get like loaded fry platters and stuff like that, but the main idea is that you can buy a size of fries and then whatever sauce you want on top. So for example here, this is the king sauce, which is a mixture of mustard and ketchup. Another unique fast food thing I saw is that they had these walls of warm and fresh food, and you could just go in and then beep with your phone and then just pull that food right out. And so it's kind of like a faster version of fast food, if that makes any sense. Another thing I knew nothing about until I saw it in a grocery store was something called hagelslag. And apparently for breakfast in the Netherlands, a lot of people will take bread and they'll butter it and then put chocolate sprinkles on top. And this is basically like a donut. And so in their grocery stores, they have just a ton of different sprinkles options. I thought this was fascinating. And additionally, in the Netherlands as well as in Germany, there are just a ton of different sausages to choose from. And so this is always one of my favorite things to see, just how many options you have on their store shelves. And of course, because it's summer, they had a wide variety of different apples and other fruits. I thought this was really impressive. And they also had red currants, and so I picked up another package and ate all of these as well. And I also found a Nintendo store, but we did not go into this one. It looked a little bit shady. So besides all of the shopping and eating that we did in Amsterdam, let me tell you about a couple of the places we visited as well. Most of these are going to be museums. To start, we went to the Van Gogh Museum. Now, Vincent van Gogh was Dutch, but he lived in France for most of his time when he was working. And so he really didn't get well known in the Netherlands until after he had passed away at a young age. Now, I've always been a fan of Van Gogh's paintings. I think that they're really vibrant and I love the use of color. And it was awesome to be able to see some of my favorite works of art in real life. I think a lot of people know about the dandelions, but I also really love the almond blossom, and so it was really awesome to be able to see this painting. So if you are a fan of Van Gogh, I think this is a great museum to visit, but just bear in mind that his most famous work, which is Starry Night, I think is at the MoMA in New York City. Now, you might remember this from the last trip video that I made about England, but my wife is a huge fan of Ted Lasso. And there was an episode that was filmed in Amsterdam, so we went to a couple of the places from there. For example, near the red light district is a monument to Chet Baker, which they visited during the show. And there's also a moment where one of the main characters falls into a canal and is saved, and it's the start of a whole plot line. And so you can go to that exact same spot, and all of it was filmed on location, including the houseboat where the guy went and jumped off to help her out. Either way, if you're a fan of the show, I would say this is definitely worth taking a detour to check out. Okay, after that we went over to the Anne Frank house. You may remember that Anne Frank lived in Amsterdam during World War II. And the house has been preserved ever since then and is now turned into a museum. Now, you're not allowed to film any footage within the house itself, but we did sign on for a tour which would talk us kind of through the entire story, and at the very least I was able to film those segments which kind of walked us through the entire timeline of her life. And after going through this little part of the tour, you're able to walk through the actual house itself, almost every single room. Now, they've left the house empty ever since the Nazis raided it way back in the day, and so there is no furniture or anything else inside. You're just kind of walking through the halls. And it really was a surreal thing to remember back to the story that I had read back when I was a kid and then walk through those actual rooms. And some of the elements of the entire house were still there. For example, they had the original sink and whatnot, but then also like some of the magazine clippings that Anne used to put on the wall, they were still there up on the wall. And probably one of the most affecting things for me, especially as a father, was that we were walking through and we saw the pencil markings on the wall that showed like the names and the heights of these children over the years. And so it's very rare that you're able to get such an intimate look at history like that, like right there front and center. And so if you do go to Amsterdam, this is probably one of the highlights of the trip for me. Moving on, the next day was a little bit rainy, but it was fine because we were mostly going to be indoors. So the next thing we did is we went to the Rijks Museum. And this is the National Museum of the Netherlands. And so most of the art is focused on their own artists, but there is some other stuff there as well. To start, this is a beautiful building, so just walking around was kind of amazing, but I was also really impressed with the overall organization and curation of each of these pieces. To put it into perspective, the art itself was really amazing, and I always love seeing this kind of stuff, but the way it was presented was mesmerizing. So I often would find myself just staring at things like cups, and I'm like, man, I can't believe I'm looking at a cup. And you're like, wait, why am I staring at a cup? And it's just because everything was organized so well and the lighting and everything else. So it was just a really excellent museum to visit just for the overall experience. And they had a ton of different artifacts, things all the way back from like medieval times up to modern and contemporary art as well. And they also do have some pieces from around the world, but for the most part, everything is very Europe focused. Regardless if you're into art, I think that going to the Rijks Museum is a must-see thing when going to Amsterdam. And there are some really famous pieces there as well, including some from Vernier. In addition to this milkmaid painting, he's the person that did the girl with the pearl earring. And probably the most prominent artist in this museum is Rembrandt, also somebody who was Dutch. And so chances are you might recognize some of his paintings. Even though this was from the 17th century, he had an influence on a lot of impressionists afterwards. His most famous work is the Night Watch, and unfortunately this one was under restoration, so we couldn't get too close, but I was able to at least see it from afar. Anyway, I don't want to turn this into an entire art piece video, but I did want to mention that if you are going to Amsterdam, it's worth your time to go to the Rijks Museum. Now after that, we wanted to travel a little bit out of Amsterdam, so we went to a nearby city called Zaandam. And this is only like a 25-minute train ride away, so just a few stops, so it was really easy to get to. Now my wife had been wanting to go here for a long time because she had seen a bunch of these buildings in like pictures on Instagram. And so yeah, some of these were really neat looking, just having that iconic, really bright colors as well as all the white trim. It was also really rainy here, so we didn't venture out too far, but I did find that there were a lot of shops and stuff. So if you are in Amsterdam, you want to get away for a little bit, I think this is a nice little quaint town. Either way, we stopped over here for a late lunch and then we made our way back to Amsterdam. And because this was our last day in Amsterdam, we just kind of walked around the city for the rest of the day and just enjoyed the sights and sounds. And from there, we just flew back home. So another 11 hours to San Francisco, then we stayed overnight there, and then another 6 hours back to Hawaii, and here I am. So altogether, I really enjoyed my trip to Europe, and I hope you got a little bit out of this as well. If anything, it just gave us the itch to visit more European cities. It's been so long, and so I really want to get back to like Italy and Spain, and I've never been to Greece, and so that's another place I've really wanted to go. A lot of people ask me, why is it that I'm going on so many trips? And, my response to that is that, yes, even though I am a full-time YouTuber, I'm also retired from the military, and one of the things that I wanted to do and prioritize when I retired was actually traveling on my own. I've mentioned it before, but when you travel in the military, you have to get like all these permissions, especially depending on the country that you're going. But once you're a retired civilian, all you have to do is just book a trip, and it's a really freeing experience. And so this is why we prioritize going on these trips. We've been saving up for years in order to be able to go on these vacations, and it's been really fun. And one of my favorite things about it is that I get to bring you along for the ride, and so I hope that you get something out of this as well. Long story short, if you've been considering going to Central Europe, specifically with Germany or Amsterdam, I think it is well worth it. We had a great time. And make sure that you check out some of those historical sites while you're there. That was probably some of the highlights of the trip for me. And probably one of the biggest pieces of advice I have is grab a battery bank, because you never know when you're going to be running out of juice, either with your retro gaming handheld or with just your phone, and so those are super handy. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.